Man faces death penalty in Dubai for murder of European ex-girlfriend. Shocking true crime story. Hook. What happens when a man pushed to the edge decides to play the ultimate game of revenge? Betrayal, secrets, and an unexpected twist await you in this true crime story. Stay with us till the end to see how one decision changes everything. Can Amir outsmart the woman who ruined his life? Watch now to find out. The air in Dubai was thick, heavy with the stifling humidity. It clung to his skin, made every breath feel like it was swallowed by the heat. Amir stood on the balcony of his high-rise apartment, staring out at the glittering skyline. The city was alive, vibrant, with its lights dancing like stars across the desert. But inside there was a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. A knock at the door shattered the stillness. He hesitated, then walked slowly toward it. His heart thudded in his chest. He hadn't expected her to show up tonight. Tess. She was European, his ex-girlfriend, now just a ghost in his life. But she wasn't just any ex. She had a way of pulling him back in, always just when he thought he was free. Amir opened the door. Her face was drawn, tired, as if life had stripped her of something vital. But her eyes, they were sharp, piercing. She stepped in without waiting for an invitation. "I need to talk to you," she said, voice low but firm. Her presence felt like an intrusion. He hadn't wanted this. Not now. Not ever again. She sat down on the leather sofa, her movements slow but deliberate. Her eyes scanned the room, as though she was looking for something. He stood by the door, not sure what to say. The silence was thick between them. "You look different," Amir finally said, his voice a mix of anger and curiosity. Tess didn't respond right away. Instead, she pulled out an envelope from her bag and slid it across the table. He didn't touch it. His fingers curled into fists, his breath shallow. "What is this?" he asked, though he already knew. She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity he hadn't seen in years. "Why are you here, Tess?" he demanded, stepping closer now, the tension thickening. "Because I know what you did," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Amir froze. The words felt like ice in his veins. She knew. She knew everything. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. His pulse quickened. Every thought in his mind scrambled. "How much do you know?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Tess didn't blink. She was calm. Too calm. "I know what you did to him," she said. Her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. He staggered back, his knees weak. "Shut up," he snapped, the blood rushing to his face. But Tess didn't listen. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You killed him, Amir," she said, a smirk playing on her lips. The room spun. His world was crumbling around him. She couldn't have known. She couldn't, but she did. And now, she was here to make him pay. The door slammed behind her, and Amir was left standing alone. The silence was deafening. Amir's breath hitched, panic rising like bile in his throat. His fingers trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. Tess had no right. She couldn't, she shouldn't. But her words echoed, louder and louder in his mind. "You killed him, Amir." He staggered backward, his thoughts spiraling into chaos. The faint hum of the city outside felt so distant now, as if the world had slipped away, leaving him alone with this suffocating truth. The guilt, the dread, the fear, they all merged into a single, overwhelming wave. His palms grew clammy, slick with sweat. "Please, Tess," he rasped, his voice cracking. "You don't understand." She cut him off, her tone suddenly sharp, calculated. "I understand more than you think." Amir's head spun. He wanted to escape, to flee, but there was no way out. Not now. Not with Tess standing there, watching him like a predator. "What do you want from me?" he choked out. Tess rose from the sofa, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step louder than the last. "I want you to pay for what you did." The words hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. Pay. Amir could barely form the question. His mind raced, fighting to grasp onto something, anything that would make sense of this moment. "You're going to confess, Amir," Tess continued, "or else I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." The truth he'd buried so deep, so far in the past. He could still hear the scream, the desperation, the blood. It was a nightmare that never ended. "You can't. You won't," he whispered, a cold, bitter laugh slipping out. But Tess was unfazed. Her eyes were cold, unblinking, unwavering. "I already have," she said. A chill shot through him, ice cold. His chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. He felt as though the walls were closing in, the air suffocating him with every second that passed. "You think you can stop me?" Tess's voice had dropped to a low, dangerous murmur. "I've already sent it to the authorities." The world tilted on its axis. His heart thundered in his ears. "You wouldn't—" His voice cracked. But Tess was already turning to leave. Her silhouette was framed by the door, her figure sharp against the harsh lights of the hallway. "Enjoy your last days of freedom, Amir," she called over her shoulder. And then she was gone. The door slammed shut, leaving Amir in a deafening silence. His mind raced, each thought darker than the last. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. Amir's legs buckled beneath him. He sank to the floor, his hands gripping his head as if trying to stop the flood of memories rushing back. Her words were burned into his mind. "I've already sent it to the authorities." The walls seemed to close in, the air heavy with the weight of what he knew was coming. He could already feel it, his entire life crashing down. The knock at the door seemed almost inevitable, a sharp, insistent sound that sliced through the tense silence. Amir froze. His breath was shallow, ragged. He couldn't move, not yet. The knock came again, louder, more urgent. Amir stood slowly, his knees unsteady as he made his way toward the door. His hand shook as he reached for the handle. He knew what he would find on the other side, but he still hoped. He still wished, prayed it was a mistake. He opened the door. A pair of uniformed officers stood there, their expressions unreadable. They didn't say a word. One of them stepped forward, holding a piece of paper. "Are you Amir Al-Farsi?" the officer asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Amir nodded slowly, unable to speak. The air was thick, pressing against his chest. "You're under arrest for the murder of Khalid Hassan," the officer continued. The words felt like a slap, a nightmare come true. He wanted to deny it, to scream that it wasn't true, but his mouth went dry. The officer handed him the paper. Amir stared at it, his eyes blurry. The charge, the evidence, the confession. Everything was there, in black and white. Tess had followed through. She had done it. She had destroyed him. The officers stepped inside. One of them placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the door. Amir's mind raced, scrambling for any escape, any way to undo what had been done. But it was too late. The truth had already spread. He was trapped. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound sharp and final. His chest tightened. This was it. The life he had built, the lies, the blood. Everything was unraveling. He was going to pay. And there was no escape. They led him down the hallway, the cold echo of their footsteps growing louder with every step. Amir's mind felt like it was in a haze, disconnected from the reality of what was happening around him. His apartment, the place he had once called home, faded in the distance. He couldn't escape the images flooding his mind. Khalid's face, the blood, the suffocating terror of that night. It felt like a dream, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But it was real, so real. Outside, the bright lights of Dubai's Skyline blurred past as they shoved him into the back of a black SUV. The car doors slammed shut with a finality that sent a tremor through his body. The officers sat on either side of him, their eyes never leaving him. He couldn't breathe, the tightness in his chest, the sickening knot in his stomach. He could feel it all. He had known this day would come, but the reality of it was suffocating. The silence in the car was oppressive, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Amir stared out the window, trying to distract himself, trying to block out the thoughts threatening to drown him. But then, just as quickly as the silence had settled in, the officer next to him spoke. "You'll be facing the death penalty, Mr. Al-Farsi," he said coldly. The words hung in the air like a hammer, heavy and merciless. Death. It wasn't just a possibility now. It was inevitable. Amir closed his eyes, letting the harsh words sink in. His entire life had led to this moment. Every choice, every lie, every breath, and now he was paying for it. He had been too arrogant, too blind to see it coming. The car veered left, heading toward the detention center. He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. The thought of the interrogation, the trial, the life he had built, slipping away so easily. And Tess. He couldn't shake her face from his mind. Her eyes, so cold, so calculating. She had set this in motion. She had destroyed him. But why? What was her endgame? Why come after him now? The car slowed, pulling into the prison complex. The gates loomed ahead, dark and imposing, like the mouth of a beast waiting to swallow him whole. Amir could feel the gravity of the moment in his bones. His life, as he knew it, was over. And the darkness was closing in. The car came to a stop with a jolt, the tires crunching against the gravel beneath. The heavy gates of the detention center loomed before him, black and foreboding. Amir's stomach twisted, a wave of nausea sweeping over him. He was here. He could already hear the distant sounds of shouting, the clang of steel doors, the clatter of metal against metal. The officers nudged him out of the vehicle. His legs felt like lead as he stumbled forward, guided by their firm grip. The lights above were harsh, casting sharp shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. He was no longer in control of anything, not his fate, not his future. Everything had slipped from his grasp. They led him through the gates, past rows of towering concrete walls, until they reached a solitary room in the heart of the complex. His cell. The door slammed shut behind him with an eerie finality. He stood there, disoriented for a moment, his breath shallow and rapid. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, the claustrophobia tightening around his chest. This was his reality now. Alone, trapped. The silence was deafening. He dropped to his knees, his hands running over the cold concrete floor, searching for something to ground him. But there was nothing, just the echo of his own breath, the pounding of his heart, the relentless throb of fear in his veins. His mind flashed back to that night, Khalid, the struggle, the blood. He could still hear the gurgling sound of Khalid's last breath, still feel the weight of the man's body as it crumpled to the floor. And Tess, her cold, calculating eyes, watching from the shadows. She had orchestrated all of this, hadn't she? She had made sure he would pay. But why? What was her true motivation? Was it revenge? Was it something deeper? Amir's thoughts were a whirlpool, spinning faster and faster, until he felt like he was drowning in them. He slammed his fist against the cold wall, the pain grounding him for a brief moment. But it didn't help. The reality was still there, choking him. The door to the cell opened suddenly, the sharp clang of the metal echoing in the empty space. A guard stepped inside, his face expressionless. "You have a visitor," the guard said flatly. Amir's chest tightened. A visitor? Who? Tess. But before he could ask, the guard turned on his heel, motioning for Amir to follow. He had no choice. His legs moved on their own, carrying him down a dimly lit hallway. The sound of his footsteps was muffled by the thick stone walls, but the tension was palpable, like a drumbeat pounding in his head. As they reached the visitation room, Amir's pulse quickened. Through the glass partition, he could make out a figure sitting at the table. Tess. She was there, her gaze locked onto his as soon as he entered. Her eyes were cold, almost void of emotion. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. Amir could feel the weight of her presence in that room, like a storm waiting to break. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she leaned forward, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "You know, I didn't want this for you, Amir." His breath hitched. She was playing with him, toying with his mind. "You didn't want this?" he whispered, barely able to get the words out. Tess didn't respond immediately. Her expression remained unreadable. "You made your choices," she said coldly, "and now you face the consequences." Amir could feel the walls closing in again, the suffocating weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wanted to shout, to scream at her, but he didn't have the energy. "You're a coward," he muttered. "You used me." Her lips curled into a faint smile. "No, Amir, you used yourself. I just made sure the world would see you for what you really are." The words cut through him like a blade. He felt small, weak, and for the first time since everything had unraveled, Amir realized the truth. Tess had always been the one in control. She had played him from the start, and now there was no way out. Amir's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white against the tension that had seized his body. She was right. She had always been in control. But the weight of her words, the cold precision with which she spoke, felt like a final judgment. His mind scrambled, looking for a way to fight back, to change the course of this nightmare. But deep down, he knew there was no escape. Tess had already sealed his fate. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice thick with frustration. "You think you've won?" Tess's smile didn't waver. Her gaze never left his, unflinching, like a predator watching its prey struggle. "Winning was never my goal, Amir," she said quietly, almost as if she were explaining something to a child. "I didn't need to win. You did this to yourself." The words hit him harder than he expected, sinking deeper into his bones. He had done this to himself. His greed, his arrogance, his impulsiveness. The night that had seemed so simple, so easy, had been his undoing. His mind raced back to the confrontation with Khalid, the desperate struggle, the panic flooding his veins as his hands tightened around the man's throat. The desperation in Khalid's eyes, the gurgled gasps for air. It had been a moment of insanity, a moment that he had convinced himself was justified. But now he saw it for what it truly was. Tess had never been the cause. She was just the one who had pushed him to the edge, exposed his worst instincts. "How much do you really know, Tess?" he finally asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain composed. Her eyes flickered for a moment, just the slightest hesitation before she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I know everything, Amir," she said, each word a slow and deliberate strike. "I know what you did to Khalid, and I know why you did it." A cold sweat prickled at the back of his neck, his stomach flipping. He couldn't escape the suffocating pressure of her presence, the weight of everything crashing down on him. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Her smile remained, but this time there was a hint of something darker behind her eyes. "Because," she said slowly, as if savoring the final moment, "I want you to know you had a choice. You always had a choice, and now it's too late." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet room. The guard stepped forward, unlocking the door. Tess turned her back to him, ready to leave. Amir's chest tightened. "Is this how it ends?" he called out, desperate for some kind of closure, some shred of understanding. Tess paused, her hand resting on the door handle. She didn't turn around. "No, Amir," she said softly, her voice trailing off like a distant echo. "This isn't how it ends. This is just the beginning." With that, she walked out of the room, the door slamming shut behind her. The echo of her departure left a void in Amir's chest, a suffocating emptiness. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where she had been. A piece of him wanted to scream, to break free, but deep down he knew there was no escape. Tess had already won, and now the consequences were his to face alone. Amir stood motionless, staring at the door that had just closed behind Tess. The room felt colder now, the weight of his isolation pressing down on him like a thick, unrelenting fog. His mind raced, trying to piece together some semblance of understanding, but it felt impossible. Tess had left, and with her, she had taken the last thread of control he had ever held over his life. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in the otherwise still room. The walls seemed to close in on him once again. What did she mean by the beginning? What was she planning? How much more of this could he endure? His breath came in shallow bursts, and for the first time since his arrest, Amir felt completely alone. No one was coming to save him. There was no escape from the path Tess had set him on. The guard returned moments later, the door to the visitation room swinging open with a harsh screech. Amir barely looked up as he was escorted back to his cell, the cold metal doors clanging shut behind him once again. He sank onto the hard cot, his mind still spinning. The reality of what Tess had done to him, to Khalid, to everything, felt too much to process. His fingers brushed his temples, trying to quiet the storm inside his head. Every action, every decision, every lie that had brought him here played like a reel of film, running through his mind in flashes. It was a blur of faces, places, and moments he couldn't undo. But one thing was painfully clear. Tess had orchestrated it all, and she wasn't done yet. The thought chilled him to his core. What if she wasn't just after revenge? What if this was part of something bigger? What if she was still pulling strings behind the scenes, preparing for something worse? Amir's stomach twisted again, his mind unable to stop spiraling. He couldn't let it end like this. He couldn't just sit here and let Tess win. There had to be a way to fight back, a way to turn the tables. But the more he thought about it, the less certain he became. Was there any way to escape the consequences now? Or was this his end? The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of his thoughts. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. Amir froze. Was it another visitor? Or worse, was it Tess returning to finish whatever game she had started? The door creaked open, and a new figure stepped inside. It wasn't Tess. It was a man, dressed in plain clothes, his face unrecognizable to Amir. The man stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Amir. "I'm here to talk," the man said, his voice calm, yet carrying a sense of urgency. Amir's heart skipped a beat. He studied the man closely, trying to figure out his intentions. Who was he? Talk about what? Amir asked cautiously, his voice hoarse from the stress. The man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. About your future, and how you can still make things right. Amir's breath caught in his throat. His mind buzzed with confusion. How could this stranger possibly think he had any future left? Make things right. Amir echoed, disbelief thick in his voice. "I've lost everything. What's left to fix?" The man didn't immediately answer. He seemed to weigh his words carefully before stepping closer. "The question isn't about what's left, Amir," the man said slowly. "The question is whether you're willing to pay the price to reclaim what's yours." Amir blinked, trying to process the cryptic words. Reclaim what? His freedom? His life? Before he could speak, the man held up a small envelope, one that Amir hadn't noticed before. "I can help you," the man continued, his tone almost whispering now. "But it comes at a cost. The price is high, and there's no turning back." Amir's pulse quickened. He reached for the envelope, his fingers trembling. "What's inside?" he demanded, suddenly desperate to know. The man didn't answer directly. He simply stepped back, his hand resting on the door, ready to leave. "If you're interested, we'll talk again. But understand this, Amir. Tess isn't the only one pulling strings, and you've just become a pawn in a much bigger game." With that, the man turned and walked out, leaving Amir alone again with the envelope in his hand. Amir's heart raced. He stared at the envelope, unsure of what he should do next. Was this another trap? Another piece of Tess's twisted game? Or was this the lifeline he needed to turn everything around? The silence that followed felt deafening, and in the back of his mind, Amir knew one thing. This moment would define his fate. That Amir's fingers trembled as he stared at the envelope in his hands. It felt too light to hold such weight. He wanted to tear it open immediately, to know what lay inside, but a voice deep within him warned against it. What if this was just another manipulation? What if this stranger was playing him, just like Tess had? He glanced toward the door, his pulse quickening. The guard was nowhere in sight, and the hallway outside his cell was eerily quiet. Everything felt suspended in time, like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether the ground would hold. But he couldn't stand still, not anymore. His heart hammered in his chest as he finally tore open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. Amir unfolded it with care, his eyes scanning the words quickly. Asterisk, meet me at midnight. The warehouse by the docks. Come alone. There's a way out, but you need to make a choice. Asterisk. His breath caught in his throat. The words were short, direct. No explanations. No further instructions. A way out. Could it really be that simple? He stared at the paper, the possibilities swirling in his mind. Who was this man? Why did they think he could still make a choice? What was waiting for him at the warehouse? His instinct screamed at him to be cautious, to not trust anyone. But something inside him, a desperate need for redemption, for control, urged him to go. The ticking clock in his mind began to grow louder. It was almost midnight. The last few hours had felt like a blur. But now, with this opportunity hanging before him, everything seemed to sharpen into focus. This could be his chance, a way out. A chance to reclaim his life, to undo the damage Tess had caused. But how much was he willing to risk? Amir stood, pacing the small cell. His mind raced through the options. If he went to the warehouse, would he be walking straight into a trap? Or could it truly be an opportunity, something real? He had no time to waste. Midnight was approaching quickly, and the longer he hesitated, the more he felt like the walls of his cell were closing in, like he was suffocating in his own fear. A choice. The paper had promised him a choice, but the cost was unknown. Amir's heart pounded as the minutes ticked by. He needed to decide. There were no guarantees, but if there was even the slightest chance to escape Tess's grip, to fight back against the forces pulling him into darkness, he had to take it. With shaking hands, he slipped the paper into his pocket, his jaw clenched tight. Tonight he would go, and he would face whatever awaited him at the warehouse. The door to his cell creaked open once more, the guard's shadow falling across the threshold. Amir didn't look back. His mind was already miles away, racing toward the docks. The choice was made. Amir stepped out of the cell, his pulse thumping in his ears, as though his heart was trying to break free from his chest. The guard gave him a passing glance, but said nothing, the usual disinterest in his eyes as he motioned for Amir to follow. Amir's mind was elsewhere, consumed by the single thought of what was waiting for him. The letter burned in his pocket, its message echoing in his head. Asterisk the warehouse by the docks. Come alone, asterisk. It was almost midnight now. Time was running out. He had no choice but to keep moving forward, even if every instinct screamed at him to turn back. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he pushed on. The halls of the prison seemed to stretch endlessly as they made their way through the dimly lit corridors. The cold concrete walls whispered his thoughts back to him, reflecting the darkness that had taken root in his heart. What was the cost of freedom? What was this stranger offering him? The more he thought about it, the less certain he became, but something pushed him forward. Something deeper than logic or reason. Maybe it was the burning need to escape, to get out of Tess's web of manipulation. Or maybe it was the desire to take control again, to do something, anything, to stop feeling so powerless. Amir's footsteps quickened, his heart racing with anticipation, dread, and a sense of finality. The prison doors loomed ahead. The guard unlocked them with a clang, and Amir stepped outside, blinking against the harsh light of the street lamps that lit the night air. His breath caught in his throat. The city of Dubai stretched before him, so close, yet so far. The lights, the noise, the life that had once seemed so within reach now felt like a distant memory. There was no turning back now. He glanced at the sky. The stars were hidden behind the haze of city lights, but there was something in the air tonight. Something thick, something heavy. Amir moved quickly, slipping into the shadows, avoiding the main streets, just as the letter had instructed. He didn't know what to expect at the docks, but he knew he had no choice. Every step seemed to take him further from everything he knew, but also closer to something unknown. His breath hitched as he reached the edge of the city. The docks stretched out before him, empty and silent under the moonless sky. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and decay, the faint creak of boats rocking in the distance, the only sound that filled the quiet. He glanced around nervously, his eyes darting between the dark, empty warehouses lining the water's edge. The place felt wrong, empty, yet suffocating with tension. He pulled the paper from his pocket, reading it again in the dim light. Asterisk meet me at midnight. The warehouse by the docks. Come alone, asterisk. It was past midnight now. His only choice was to move forward, deeper into the darkness. His shoes echoed against the cold pavement as he walked cautiously toward the first warehouse. The large metal doors were closed, no sign of life, no sound. He took a deep breath, nerves raw, and pushed open the door. Inside, the space was massive, dark, with only the faintest hint of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Amir's heart stopped for a split second. It was the man from earlier, the one who had given him the letter. He stood with his back to Amir, facing a wall, hands folded behind his back. Amir Al-Farsi, the man said, his voice steady but low. You made it. Amir's throat tightened. What is this? Why am I here? The man turned slowly, his face still obscured in shadow. Your future, he said simply. Or rather, the choice you make now will decide it. Amir took a step back, the weight of the words sinking in. What do you want from me? The man's eyes glinted in the dark, sharp and calculating. I'm offering you a chance to change your fate, Amir. To take control of your life again. How? Amir demanded. How is that even possible? The man stepped forward, his voice lowering. You're caught in a web, a game of power, with Tess pulling the strings. But there are others who want her out. They want her power, and they're willing to offer you a way out. Amir's heart pounded. What do you mean? Who are you? I can't give you all the details yet, the man replied, his voice a mix of calm and warning. But you're not the only one who wants Tess gone. I can help you, if you're willing to trust me. A cold shiver ran down Amir's spine. Trust? How could he trust this man when he had no idea who he was? What do you want in return? Amir asked, his voice hoarse. He already knew the answer. There was always a price. The man smiled, but it was an unsettling smile. Nothing you're not willing to pay. The words hit Amir like a slap. The silence between them stretched as Amir's mind raced. What was the cost? Was it worth it? And what would Tess do if she found out? The choice was clear, but it was also terrifying. Amir looked at the man one last time. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "What's next?" The man's eyes glinted with something dark, something calculating. He nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting Amir's response. "Good," he said, his voice low but confident. "You're smarter than most." Amir didn't like the way he said it, but he pushed the feeling aside. There was no turning back now. He had made his choice. The man stepped back, motioning for Amir to follow him deeper into the warehouse. The air was thick with dust, the faint smell of oil and rust hanging in the atmosphere. "Let me explain the details," the man continued, his pace slow, measured. "You're not the only one who has been watching Tess. She's become a liability, and those she's manipulated want her out of the picture. And you, Amir, you are the perfect person to make that happen." Amir's stomach tightened. He wanted to ask how, what, why, but the man kept walking, his tone steady, as if he were speaking to someone who already knew the rules of the game. He followed, trying to ignore the unease crawling up his spine. "You see, Tess has had a plan in motion for a long time," the man continued, his voice barely above a whisper, the shadows around him swallowing his figure. "But she made one mistake. She underestimated you, and that will be her downfall." Amir felt a surge of confusion. "What do you mean?" "Tess has everything. She's already destroyed me." The man paused in front of an old metal door at the back of the warehouse. He didn't turn to face Amir immediately, but when he did, there was a spark in his eyes. "She may have destroyed your life, Amir, but she hasn't destroyed your worth," the man said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "You're still useful." Amir's throat went dry. He wanted to scream, to tell this man he wasn't some pawn to be used. But the words stuck in his throat. The weight of everything that had led him here was too heavy. "What do you want from me?" Amir forced the words out. The man smiled again, the expression twisted in the dim light. "It's simple. You'll make a choice, Amir. A choice that will either see you back in control or buried in the wake of Tess's destruction." He turned the handle and pushed open the door. Inside was a small room, its walls covered in dark, peeling paint. On a metal table in the center, a stack of documents lay, sealed and ready. Amir hesitated for a moment, his hands still gripping the doorframe. The silence between them was thick, filled with tension. The man motioned to the papers. "These are the tools to take Tess down. A carefully constructed set of plans. Her secrets, her alliances, the people she's been working with." Amir stepped inside, his curiosity pulling him forward despite the storm of questions that had yet to be answered. "Why me?" Amir asked, his voice shaking now, a mixture of desperation and disbelief. "Why would you trust someone like me with this?" The man's eyes softened for a brief moment. "Because, Amir, you understand what it means to lose everything. You know what it's like to be at rock bottom. And that's exactly why you're the perfect person to do this." Amir stepped closer to the table, his eyes scanning the documents. Names, dates, locations, all of Tess's carefully crafted network of influence, laid out in front of him like a map to her downfall. The man was right about one thing. Tess had made him feel small, powerless. But now, in this cold room, with these documents in front of him, Amir felt something stir deep inside him, a flicker of hope, a hint of control. "You don't have much time," the man said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "Tess has enemies. They're getting closer. She's starting to make moves, and those moves will lead her to destroy you if you don't act fast." The words hung in the air, thick with the promise of something irreversible. The man took a step back. Take the documents, Amir. Study them. You'll know what to do when the time comes. Amir's heart was pounding now, his hands sweating as he reached out and grabbed the stack of papers. The weight of it all hit him immediately. The gravity of what he was about to step into sinking in like cold water. He turned back to face the man, his voice barely a whisper. What happens if I decide to do this? The man didn't flinch. You get your life back, Amir. You get control over your future. But understand this. Once you make that choice, there's no going back. Amir's mind was racing, the pieces falling into place. His options were clear, yet unclear all at once. Take the documents, play his part, and maybe, just maybe, he would have a chance to escape Tess's clutches. But at what cost? What would he have to sacrifice? He looked at the man, the weight of his words sinking in. What's the catch? Amir asked, his voice low and dangerous. The man smiled, the look in his eyes cold and calculating. The catch is simple, Amir. If you fail, Tess wins, and she won't be forgiving. But if you succeed, you'll be more than just free. You'll be untouchable. Amir's hands shook as he gripped the papers. The silence felt suffocating. A new chapter was about to begin. But which side would he choose to be on? Amir's breath came in shallow bursts, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his chest. The man's words echoed in his ears, mingling with the constant thrum of his pulse. Untouchable, the man had said. The idea was both intoxicating and terrifying. But the reality was that Amir was standing on the precipice of something that could change everything. There was no going back, not now. He stared down at the stack of papers in his hands, his fingers grazing the edge. Each document felt like a part of Tess's empire. Her hidden truths, her betrayals, her darkest secrets, all within his grasp. But with that power came the risk of everything he had left unraveling. Tess had been ruthless. She wouldn't hesitate to destroy him if she found out he was trying to bring her down. Amir's mind whirled. He could feel the weight of the choice settling in like a chain tightening around his throat. Was he willing to face Tess again, this time as her enemy, to risk everything for a chance at something more? Or would he back down, return to the life she had stolen from him, and live with the consequences of his inaction? The man watched him, his face unreadable. He didn't rush Amir. He simply waited, as though he knew the decision had already been made. You've got the tools now, the man said finally, his voice a low whisper. It's up to you what you do with them. Amir swallowed hard, the taste of metal on his tongue. If I do this, if I take down Tess, what happens to me? The man's eyes flashed with something like approval. That's for you to decide. But understand this. If you choose to fight back, you're not just fighting Tess. There are others involved, powerful people who will notice. You'll become a player in a game much bigger than you've ever imagined. The weight of those words hit Amir like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about Tess. This wasn't just about getting his life back. This was about stepping into a world of shadows, where trust was a commodity that could be bought or destroyed in an instant. Amir felt the chill of uncertainty crawling under his skin, and yet he couldn't deny the pull, the desire to regain control, to face Tess, not as the broken man she had made him, but as someone who could look her in the eye and destroy everything she had built. His fingers clenched tighter around the documents, the paper crinkling in his grip. You won't be alone, the man said, his voice cutting through Amir's thoughts. There will be allies, there will be enemies, and there will be choices. But remember, each decision will either bring you closer to freedom or drag you deeper into a game you may never escape. Amir didn't know if it was the man's words or the weight of his own thoughts, but something in him snapped. I'm in, he said, his voice harder than he felt, more certain than he was. I'll do it, The man's lips twitched upward into something that might have been a smile. "Good," he said, stepping toward the table and pulling a small device from his coat pocket. "This will help you get started." He placed the device on the table in front of Amir. It was small, sleek, and unassuming, but Amir recognized it for what it was immediately: a phone. The man tapped it lightly, then pushed it toward Amir. "There's a number saved on it. You'll need it sooner than you think. Trust the people who reach out to you." Amir didn't move to take it. The phone felt like a lifeline and a trap at once. "And if I can't trust them?" Amir asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's gaze hardened. "You won't have much of a choice." Amir reached out, his hand steady, and took the phone. It felt heavier than it looked. He slid it into his pocket, the weight of the device symbolizing everything he was about to enter, everything he was about to become. The man stepped back, folding his arms across his chest, his eyes studying Amir. "I'll be in touch," he said, his voice carrying an edge that Amir couldn't ignore. "But for now, your task is simple. You'll need to get to Tess, get close to her again. You'll have to play her game, find her weaknesses, and wait for the right moment. The documents will guide you. But remember, Tess won't give up easily. She'll come after you." Amir nodded slowly, his mind already racing. He had been close to Tess once, had been inside her world, had trusted her once, too. It had almost destroyed him. Now he had to do it again. He had to become the man Tess never saw coming. The door creaked open, and Amir was startled to find himself alone again in the cold, quiet warehouse. The man was gone. Amir stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of everything settle in around him. He could still hear the echo of the man's words in his mind, their meaning growing clearer with each passing second. This wasn't just about Tess. This was about something far bigger than him, and he was already too deep in it to turn back. With a deep breath, Amir turned on his heel and walked out into the night. The first move had been made. Now, there was no turning back. Amir's footsteps echoed against the empty streets as he walked away from the warehouse, the phone burning in his pocket, like a constant reminder of what he had just committed to. The weight of it all pressed on him. He had taken the first step into a dangerous game, a game where the stakes were his life, his freedom, and everything he'd lost. His mind raced, each thought colliding with the next, a chaotic jumble of fear, anger, and determination. Tess. He had to get close to her again, had to enter her world, pretend to be the man she thought she knew. But this time he wouldn't be the pawn. He would be the one pulling the strings. The thought made him sick. How had he let himself get this far? How had he let someone like her dictate his every move? The answer came quickly. He had been blinded by love, by trust, by the hope that Tess was someone worth fighting for. But now, that illusion was shattered. She had used him, manipulated him, thrown him away when he no longer served her. And for that, Amir would make her pay. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the phone. The screen lit up with a single notification, a message. He swallowed, his heart pounding as he tapped the screen. The message was simple, direct. Asterisk, the first step is to get close to her again. She'll be expecting you. Trust no one. Use the information in the documents. But remember, your window is small. Don't waste it. Asterisk. The message chilled him. Someone was watching him, guiding him, but also reminding him of the danger he was in. He had no time to waste. His mind shifted to Tess, to the game he would have to play. She was clever, ruthless. He knew her better than anyone. He knew how she thought, how she moved through the world, how she used people to get what she wanted. But he also knew her weaknesses, and that was his advantage. He had to get close to her, gain her trust, just long enough to find the right moment, the right crack in her armor. His fingers tightened around the phone, his thoughts narrowing to a single point. He needed to see Tess again, to be in her presence, to begin the dance of deception. And then, Just as quickly as that thought had come, another one followed. Asterisk, what if it's a trap? What if this is all part of her plan? Asterisk. He shook his head, pushing the doubt aside. He couldn't afford to hesitate now, not after everything he had already sacrificed. The night air was cold, but his skin felt too hot, like his body was reacting to the weight of the decisions he had made. It wasn't just about Tess anymore. It was about power, revenge, and reclaiming control over his life. And with that realization, something darker stirred inside him. A hunger, a thirst for everything he had lost. The game had already begun, and there was no turning back. Amir quickened his pace, the city around him blurring into the background. He had a plan to execute, a mission to complete, and no time to waste. The only thing that mattered now was winning. He had already stepped into the shadows. The question was, how far was he willing to go to survive in them? Would he become the monster he'd always feared, or would he emerge victorious? Only time would tell, and time, Amir knew, was running out. Amir stood at the edge of the rooftop, staring down at the city below. Dubai was alive, pulsing with light, energy, and power. But to him, it was a distant world, one he no longer belonged to. The choices he'd made in the past weeks had led him here, to this moment. A life suspended between two worlds, one where he was the victim of Tess's manipulations, and one where he had taken control, becoming the puppet master instead. His fingers tightened around the phone in his pocket. The device had been both his lifeline and his curse. Messages, calls, orders, it had all been part of the plan. Tess had made him believe he was nothing. She had used him, betrayed him, and left him broken. But now, the roles had reversed. He had learned her game, understood her secrets, and used them against her. It was almost time. He could feel it, deep in his bones, the moment when everything would change. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his reverie. He turned, his heart skipping a beat, expecting to see the man who had set him on this path. But instead it was Tess. She stood there, framed by the doorway, her eyes narrowing as they met his. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to suffocate. "You thought you could outplay me?" Tess's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried all the weight of the years of manipulation, of betrayal. Amir didn't flinch. "I didn't think. I knew." Tess smiled, but it was cold, empty. "You were never meant to win, Amir. You were always meant to be a pawn. And now, you've become a liability." For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The city, the noise, the air itself. It was just him and Tess. A final confrontation. "You underestimated me," Amir said, his voice steady. "I'm no one's pawn anymore." Tess's smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough. Amir took a step forward, his hand reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the device, the one that held her fate. The game was over. "I told you," Amir said, his voice cold. "I always knew how to play this game. But now, it's my turn." And in that final moment, Amir pressed the button. The device beeped once, twice, and everything changed. The lights around them flickered. The walls seemed to shift. Tess's eyes widened, realizing too late that her empire was crumbling around her. But Amir had already won. Amir stood motionless, his breath slow and steady, watching Tess's reaction. The cold, calculating look she had always worn was now replaced by something else. Shock, disbelief, fear. She had always thought she was untouchable, always been one step ahead. But now it was clear she hadn't seen this coming. The device in Amir's hand had been the key. The plans, the secrets, everything he had learned from the documents. He had used it all, piece by piece, to bring her down. Tess took a step back, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't know what you've done," she spat, her hands trembling as she reached for something unseen in the air. Amir didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I've done." The silence between them grew heavy. Tess's eyes flicked from him to the device, and for the first time, Amir saw something raw in her, vulnerable. The woman who had once controlled everything was now completely at his mercy. But Amir didn't want vengeance, not really. What he had wanted was the chance to reclaim his life, to undo the damage she had caused. This was the final step, the choice he had made when he decided to take control. It wasn't about destroying Tess. It was about freeing himself. "Why didn't you leave me alone?" Amir asked quietly. His voice was steady, but the words hung heavy in the air. "You could have walked away. You could have just let me be. But you kept coming back, kept manipulating." Tess's lips trembled, and for a brief moment, her arrogance cracked. "I didn't want to lose you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I thought I could control you." Amir's chest tightened at her words. For a fleeting second, he wondered if there had been a part of her that truly cared, but he quickly pushed it away. There were no more second chances, not after everything she had done. With a final glance at her, Amir turned, his footsteps quiet as he walked toward the door. He felt the weight of the past lift, as though a heavy chain had been broken. He had played the game. He had won. But in the end, it wasn't Tess who had been defeated. It was the man he had once been, the man she had destroyed. As the door closed behind him, Amir stepped out into the cool night, finally free.